You're listening to Claiming Space, a show that holistically questions our pursuits of new frontiers, centered around the social sciences. In the space industry, Claiming Space features diverse voices and perspectives with a specific focus on digital economies in space ecosystems. We talk to experts from a wide range of sectors in social sciences, technology, and the arts that affect not only our daily lives on Earth, but also beyond, that are parables to each other. I'm your host, Vikram. Today we have Dr. Erika Nesvold. Erika has a Ph.D. in physics from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County in the US, and has conducted astrophysics research at NASA Goddard and the Carnegie Institute of Washington. She currently works as an astrophysics engineer on the Universe Sandbox astrophysics simulator. She also created the podcast miniseries Making New Worlds in 2017 about the ethical issues of settling in space. In 2018, she co-founded a nonprofit called the JustSpace Alliance, along with Dr. Lucianne Walkowicz, who we've featured here before on Claiming Space. The JustSpace Alliance advocates for a more ethical and inclusive future in the space industry. Let's get started. Yeah. Hey, Erika, welcome to Claiming Space. It's really exciting to have you here today. So I was wondering, how about we start and ask, because I normally ask people every time on the show, what inspired you to get into what you're doing right now? Has it been something you've always been interested in as a child?
So great question. I've definitely always loved space since I was a child. I was into science fiction. I wanted to be an astronaut, still want to be an astronaut. And I went to school to I got a Ph.D. in physics and worked as a research astronomer. So I've always loved space. But it was while I was working as a research astronomer, I was a postdoc actually, and I was doing a program out in Silicon Valley with NASA and SETI, and I met a bunch of people in the space industry. Yeah. And in talking to them, that got me really thinking about space ethics, because I got the impression that they weren't thinking about issues that they might run into that were more in the social sciences, ethics and social justice and environmentalism. They were so focused on the technical and economic parts that they were sort of ignoring that. But as a scientist, I didn't know much about the social science parts of it. So I started looking around, doing some research for myself, and I started a podcast because it's a great way to meet interesting people, as I'm sure you're learning. And I started interviewing people about these different topics. Specifically, I was interviewing people like historians and activists and ethicists who think about these issues here on Earth and maybe hadn't even thought about them in space, but were happy to think about them in space context. And that's what got me really into thinking about these ideas.
Okay, cool. So, sort of what drew you to the, so I think you just pretty much answered that. I was going to ask you what drew you to space ethics. And is it relatively new, or has it been around for some time? The topic, space ethics.
That's a good question. A lot of people these days are starting to talk about it as if it's brand new. Usually that just means the person talking about it has just discovered it for the first time. The thing is that there's so many different parts of space ethics, and some of them, like the ethics parts, have been around, since the Western field of ethics in general, and even beyond that. But other parts are about as old as the space program, I would say. People started talking about planetary protection issues and economic justice issues at the start of the U.S. space program. And there's philosophers whose whole career is in space ethics these days and are writing books about it and writing academic papers, and they're doing serious work on this stuff already. But the rest of the space industry has been ignoring them a lot. And I think that just now, as more people are getting involved in the space industry, the private side of space industry, more people are coming into that field and saying, I feel like we're missing something. And they're starting to look around for information from experts on the ethics sides. And that's great from my view.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So why do you think we need to talk about ethics of space settling now, when it's when it'll be years before we even look at settling in space or have space colonies or all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, that's a fair question. A lot of want to talk about is specifically about space settlement, which is probably not going to happen in my lifetime. Maybe the early stages of it. You could say now that the private spaceflight industry that's developing is the early stages of human space settlement, but it's going to take hundreds of years. And so I think it's easy to say, well, we'll worry about that later, which is mostly the answer I got in Silicon Valley when I was talking to these people and asked them questions about how they'd handle different ethics things. They would say, oh, well, we'll worry about that when they get there.
Yeah.
But two issues with that I see. One is that ethics is so important that it has to be built in at the planning stages. You can't wait until you get to Mars and then realize that you didn't bring the right medical equipment. And you also don't want to wait until you get to Mars to realize that maybe you should have put an infrastructure in place to protect labor rights, for example, or you need to think about what economic system you have to have. You really have to do that as far ahead of time as you can. And the other thing is that the space industry already exists. It's already happening here on Earth, and there's already human rights issues with the space industry here on Earth, labor rights issues, for example. And so we need to be thinking about it now so that we're doing the right thing on Earth, so that we can learn what the right thing is and how to fight for what's right so that we can have it in space.
Okay. Yeah, I think I know what you mean. Because what we were just discussing before we started recording about creating digital political economies, the idea is to bake all of these values and these ethics into these economies, like programmatically, so that you can ensure these sort of values stick around. Sort of, yeah. So
exactly.
what are the most urgent and time-sensitive issues in space ethics today?
So that's something I think about a lot because there's so many different topics you could talk about in space settlement, which is great if you're trying to fill up a podcast or write a book. But it's hard if you're trying to figure out what to focus on first. So like someday we'll have to think about reproductive rights in space, but that's not today. On the other end of the spectrum, though, there is stuff, like I said, happening on Earth today that we should be focused on if we want the space industry to be ethical. One of them, as I mentioned, is labor rights. Some of the companies that are making the biggest strides in the private space industry have labor rights issues, or they're owned by people with other companies that have labor rights issues. So I'm talking here about Elon Musk and SpaceX and Tesla have both had controversies about labor rights. Jeff Bezos with Amazon and their anti-union practices are something that need to be focused on if we care about the future of Blue Origin and Bezos' space company and how those employees will be treated.
Yeah.
And another thing that is happening now, as we saw this week, because this is just a few days after Perseverance landed on Mars, we do have things landing on surfaces in space, even if we don't have a lot of humans out there yet. And so planetary protection is something we have to think about urgently. And that's mostly about protecting the space environment and any potential microbes living there from us and our contamination from our biology.
Okay.
And that's something NASA thinks about a lot. There's a lot of regulations in place, but as more private actors start to go out there and send rovers and mining equipment, et cetera, into space, they need to be regulated as well.
Okay, cool. So could you tell us a bit more about the Making New World podcast? Because I did listen to a few of those episodes. They're really interesting. You got really great guests on each of them. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. So this was a limited run podcast. I only did 13 episodes and it was back in 2017, 2018, but you can still find all the episodes online. And you can also read transcripts on the Making New World's website if you aren't listening. And I just basically broke down about a dozen different topics that I thought we needed to think about in space settlement. And I've mentioned a few of them: labor rights, reproductive rights, medical ethics, property rights, like who's going to own Mars, things like that. And in each episode, I talked to 2 or 3 different people. Usually I try to include a colonial historian, since colonization has happened so many times on Earth. And there's a lot of historians that study that, and we can look to the past to learn lessons about what we should and shouldn't do in the future. And I also talked to a few people in the space industry. I really enjoyed making the podcast, and it was amazing how many people I talked to who hadn't ever thought about space. But as soon as I got them thinking about it, they went, oh yeah, this is really applicable in space. In particular, there was a labor rights activist who said, I hadn't ever thought about space and labor rights before, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since I got your email. So that was really exciting.
Cool. So I think in your first episode, you mentioned the notion of manifest destiny when it comes to frontier. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Sure. One thing I think it's important for us to think about when we think about space settlement or even just space exploration is, why are we doing it? And if you ask a bunch of different advocates who are trying to advocate for space settlement, you'll get 100 different answers. But you can usually categorize those answers into a few different reasons. Some people think that we need to protect the human species from extinction by having a backup plan. Others will argue much more poetically that it's our human destiny to go to space, that it's our natural instinct to explore and to expand, and that we have the right to anything that we can go and grab out there in space, and so we should do it. And that echoes something that happened in the U.S. during the colonization of the U.S. by European settlers. And what we're taught in U.S. history is that the settlers at the time believed in manifest destiny, which was the idea that we, the white settlers from Europe, had the God-given right, basically, to the continent that we had just arrived at, and that it was spread open before us, ready for us to take over if we just put some hard work into it. And that's such a big part of American culture, even today. Like I said, I got taught this idea as a school child, but it ignores a bunch of stuff that actually happened in history, like how the settlers treated the indigenous people that were living on the continent, and also how we treated the environment of the continent. The idea that it was just there to provide for us to take led to a lot of environmental destruction. And the fact that we slaughtered a bunch of indigenous people meant that we didn't learn from them how to live with that environment sustainably. And these are the things that I worry that we'll repeat in space if we stick to this manifest destiny idea. And we'll just repeat all the same mistakes of colonialism.
Yeah. So how does, because I think in another episode you talk about colonialism and science fiction, how are they related to each other?
So science fiction is a great place to be looking when you're thinking about all of this stuff, because science fiction authors are some of the people who have been thinking about space ethics issues longer than anyone else have. But a lot of classic science fiction has this narrative of manifest destiny in it.
Yeah.
And when I say classic science fiction, I usually mean the stuff that was published and was really popular in the early days of science fiction, and that usually means a white male American or European perspective, which means you weren't really getting the full perspective on what space settlement might be like. And so there was, like I said, a lot of manifest destiny, a lot of the idea that space is there for the taking. But these days, there's an increasing diversity in who's getting published in science fiction, which is fantastic, because you're getting all these different viewpoints on what kind of societies we could build, what kind of societies, at least, that we could imagine in space, and both in terms of here's an amazing world we could create, and here's the terrible things that could happen if we make the wrong choices. And that's really exciting, and I think that we can learn from that as we have these conversations about real life.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess based on what you've learned so far, would it be reasonable to say that if we were to settle on any planet or even on the moon, should we assume, because I know that NASA does this, that they assume that that there's indigenous life before they land on a planet or anywhere. So they have sort of policies where they generally destroy, once they leave, they destroy everything, whatever was not needed, at least for their scientific experiments and stuff. But is that something we should assume that, especially private actors, should they be, when they're going into a planet or the moon, because the moon's a hot topic right now, apart from Mars, and should they assume that there's some kind of indigenous life on there by default?
So that's a great question, and it has sort of a complicated answer. So you're talking about planetary protection, which I mentioned before, which is the idea that we don't want to hurt any potential indigenous life when we go somewhere, even just accidentally. And there's a few reasons for that. One is that it's bad to hurt other life, so that's pretty obvious. And another big reason, which was one of the biggest reasons at the beginning of planetary protection that they were worried about is that we don't have any proof of life elsewhere in the universe. And if we do find it, we don't want to go, now is this actual Martian microbes, or was this something we brought on the Perseverance rover 100 years ago and it's just been growing there ever since? And so the idea that we might contaminate the scientific integrity of another planet and never know whether we had really found alien life or not is kind of terrifying to astrobiologists. So that's another big reason that we want to not contaminate other worlds. But there's been a lot of scientific research on this and a lot of thought and argument put into how we should go about doing planetary protection. NASA categorizes different planetary bodies, so moons and planets and asteroids, based on how likely it is that life could exist. So this has to do with a place's habitability. So, for example, it puts the moon in a different category as Mars because the moon is less habitable. It has less water, and we're less suspicious that there's life there. We've also been there and we've looked around, and we've got enough data now to think that it's really unlikely that there's anything living on the moon that we could contaminate. Right. And so you have to follow stricter planetary protection protocols when you send something to Mars than when you do to the moon. And what they do when they go to Mars is things like they try to sterilize the spacecraft as much as possible. No sterilization is perfect, but they have a lot of procedures for that. It gets harder when you're sending humans because you can't sterilize a human. We're crawling with microbes. And in fact, on the moon, the astronauts who went there left bags of their waste behind. So we've contaminated that environment pretty well, except it's hard for anything to live there. So it's not like there's a plague of bacteria swipes going across the moon or anything.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So when it comes to all these things that we just discussed, like, how would one sort of approach to governing these issues? Like, maybe you could briefly dive into that.
That's a great question. I can sit here and talk about all the ways that space settlements should be run in the future, but I won't be around, and there's billions of other people who might disagree with me. So the question is, okay, even if we could all decide what to do, how do we enforce that? We're never going to agree on how space settlements should be run because we don't agree on how countries should be run here on Earth. And even if we do, there's no way to make sure that our children's children's children agree with us. But that's what international law is for. So we have some treaties in place that already govern what you can and can't do in space. One of the big ones is called the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. Which was signed by all the major spacefaring nations. I think it's kind of a miraculous treaty because it was signed by both the U.S. and the Soviet Union in the middle of the Cold War about what they could and couldn't do in space. And it includes things like you're not allowed to detonate nukes in space. And the fact that they got together in the Cold War and agreed to that is kind of amazing to me. It has a few other rules. It has some rules about planetary protection. It has some rules about no military bases in space. It says no nation can appropriate territory in space, although it doesn't specify whether individuals can. So that's kind of a gray area right now, or private corporations. And so that treaty has held strong for 53 years now, which is great. I've talked to some space lawyers who have said they don't think that treaty would pass if it came up today. So that's kind of amazing too. There's also regulations in different countries. So the Outer Space Treaty says that countries are responsible for anything that launches from their territory. So in the U.S., for example, you have to get permission from the FAA to launch. You have to get permission from the FCC, which is the Federal Communications Commission, to launch telecommunications satellites. And so there are regulations. But there's also often arguments about what should be done in space. And I think that's even going to get worse as we start spreading out into space. Right now, there's a lot of room out there. There's plenty of room for different countries to do different activities once you get beyond Earth orbit. Earth orbit's kind of crowded, as you've mentioned. But, we have 3 different spacecraft from 3 different countries that arrived at Mars in the same week, the other week, from China, the UAE, and the US. And they're all just happily orbiting around. But someday, maybe we find some resources that we all want to mine in the same spot. we're going to need to go back to international law and international negotiations to agree on how to behave out there.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on like the Artemis Accords from the perspective of space ethics?
So I like the nice PR ideas behind the Artemis Accords. The idea that we should all get together and agree on how we're going to continue forward in space, sort of an extension of the Outer Space Treaty. I think that I'm not a space lawyer, and so I can't talk about any specific part of the Artemis Accords. I know the U.S. is trying to encourage and invigorate its own space mining industry, its private space mining industry. So it's in the U.S. government's best interest to make sure that their private space companies can make as much money in space as possible. And anytime there's a profit motive involved, things can get kind of murky. So we'll see how that shakes out. And we'll see if a lot of other countries sign on to the Artemis Accords. I think that'll be a good sign of whether they're going to be successful or not. So far, a few, but not a ton. Last I heard, it was something like 8. But if a country like China doesn't sign on, or Russia, we'll see how effective they are.
Okay.
But I like the idea of international cooperation.
Yeah.
I mean, we've had so much international cooperation in space that's been so successful. The fact that the International Space Station is inhabited by both Russians and the American astronauts is amazing when you look back at the Cold War and the space race. So I hope we can keep going in that direction. Okay.
Cool. So how can listeners who are excited about space ethics learn more about space ethics?
That's a great question. We have already plugged my podcast, so you can go back and listen to that, of course. But eventually that's going to get out of date. It's a couple of years old now.
Okay.
Since then, in late 2018, I co-founded a nonprofit called the JustSpace Alliance with Lucianne Walkowicz, who I think has been on your podcast as well. Yep. So we co-founded this nonprofit, the JustSpace Alliance, because we wanted to keep having conversations like you and I are having. And we wanted to bring as many people to the table to have those conversations as possible. One thing that we try to do is act as a hub between people in the space industry who want to learn more about ethics and people in the ethics industry who have the expertise that are needed, and we can connect those. And so we provide a lot of resources on our website. We tweet a lot, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to be a connection. And so if you're interested in learning more about space ethics, that's a great place to start.
Okay, cool. So I was going to ask a book, a podcast that you can recommend, but you've recommended everything. And I guess I'd also recommend the resources page on the JustSpace Alliance. So there's quite a lot, in there. So
we're hoping to organize it better, but
oh no, it's well organized, I think. That's good to hear. Then so before we conclude, where can the listeners reach out to you?
So I'm on Twitter at Erika Nesvold, and I have also the nonprofit JustSpace has a Twitter handle that I tweet on much more, which is at JustSpace.org. You can go to the website for the JustSpace Alliance, which I think is justspacealliance.org. And I think we mentioned the Making the Worlds podcast is at makingtheworlds.com.
Yeah, cool. Well, thank you for taking the time to be on here, and hope you're staying safe.
Thank you, Rick. It was great to talk to
you. Likewise. So, folks, that was Dr. Erika Nesvold, co-founder of the JustSpace Alliance and creator of the podcast miniseries Making New Worlds. I will put up all details on our blog for this episode. Until next time, be safe out there, and thanks for your time. See you soon. If you've made it all the way to the end of the show, then a really big thank you. If you're interested in being a patron for the show, you can find Claiming Space on Patreon, Anchor, and Audius platforms, where you can contribute as little as $1, as this would help with improving the show. I appreciate the time you've taken to listen to this episode and hope there's some informative content for you. If you'd like to hear more, suggest improvements, or guests, please let me know via the website's feedback form. If you could please share the episode with your friends and colleagues, subscribe, rate, and review it on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or any other platform you use, as this would help the algorithms and let people know we are out there. Until next time, see you later.